Story number 1.
I was working as a long-haul trucker in the Midwest, mostly driving solo cross-country hauls between Illinois and Arizona. It was something I picked up after the pandemic, and while the job came with a lot of solitude, I liked the peace. Most nights, I'd sleep in the cab of my truck, park at rest stops, eat out of a cooler, and wake up with the sun. Nothing fancy. But after what happened near Gallup, New Mexico, I don't know if I'll ever spend another night alone in the cab again. It was early October of 2021. The weather was starting to cool at night, but it was still warm in the daytime, especially down south. I had picked up a load of commercial restaurant equipment from Flagstaff and was heading east toward Texas. The plan was to take I-40 through Gallup, then turn south on a smaller route that cut through the desert toward Roswell. It saved a good 4 hours of driving compared to staying on the main interstate. I had taken the route a few times before, so I wasn't too concerned. Around 9:30 p.m., I pulled into a small, isolated truck stop about 15 miles outside Gallup. It was one of those older, rundown places with flickering neon signs, cracked pavement, and only 2 working gas pumps. There was an old diner next door, but it was clearly closed. The parking lot had a couple of trucks parked along the far edge, engines off, no movement inside. I figured it was safe enough to catch some sleep. I backed into a spot near the edge of the lot where the darkness of the desert reached past the chain link fence. I shut the engine off, climbed into the sleeper, and texted my dispatcher to check in. There was no cell signal. Not unusual for the area. I made myself a sandwich, read a few pages of an old paperback, and drifted off around 10:30 p.m. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. My throat was dry and my chest felt tight. At first, I thought maybe I was having a panic attack or something, but then I noticed something else. The truck felt wrong. The usual hum of the fridge, the creaks from cooling metal, everything was completely silent. And then I heard it, a soft scratching noise. It was faint, barely noticeable. It seemed to come from outside the truck. My first thought was a stray animal, maybe a coyote, nosing around the cab. I stayed still, listening. The scratching came again, this time from the driver's side door. I reached up slowly, careful not to make noise, and peeked through the curtain between the cab and the sleeper. Someone was standing next to my truck. Not a shadow or a shape, an actual person. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing what looked like a dirty hospital gown. Her skin was grayish, almost blue in the pale moonlight. Her hair hung in front of her face, but I could see her mouth moving as if she was whispering something. One hand pressed against the window, her fingers tapping lightly, like she was trying to get my attention without alerting anyone else. I froze. My phone still had no service, and I wasn't about to open the door or turn on the engine. I just crouched there behind the curtain, holding my breath. Suddenly, her head turned sharply, as if she'd heard something behind her. She crouched low and then, like a spider, crawled underneath the truck. I almost screamed. My heart was racing so fast, I thought it would explode in my chest. Who the hell was she? Was she on drugs? Was she homeless? None of that explained how fast she moved or why she looked like a corpse. After a few minutes, I heard another sound, this time from the passenger side. A loud thud, like something hitting the metal. Then, dragging. I slid toward the passenger curtain and looked out, slowly. Nothing. No one. I sat there for what must have been 20 minutes, not moving. The inside of the cab had become suffocatingly hot, and sweat dripped down my back. I considered just turning the engine on and peeling out of there, but I was terrified that if I moved, I'd trigger whatever game she was playing. Then, the scratching started again, this time from the roof. It wasn't loud, just soft, deliberate scrapes, like fingernails on metal. Slow, calculated. My whole body tensed. I imagined her crawling across the top of my cab, maybe with some rusted piece of metal or nails filed to points. And then it stopped. Total silence again. I waited. Nothing. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the curtain, jumped into the front seat, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, lights came on, and I floored it. I didn't check my mirrors, didn't look around. I just drove. I made it all the way to Roswell by 7 a.m., pulled into a diner parking lot, and parked under the brightest light I could find. When I finally climbed out to inspect the truck, I saw it. Scratches, dozens of them, across both doors, the windshield, and the roof. They weren't random either. They looked like symbols. Circles, slashes, strange curved marks that looked almost like writing. I took pictures and showed them to the mechanic at a shop later that week. He said it looked like someone had used a stone or sharp metal to etch them in, and he couldn't identify the symbols. When I showed them to a friend of mine who was Navajo, he went pale and told me never to park near Gallup again. He wouldn't say why. To this day, I don't know who she was or what she wanted, but I've never slept at a remote truck stop since. A few months later, I was running another late route from Ohio to Kansas. Somewhere around 11 p.m., I had to take a detour due to construction and ended up on a smaller highway that cut through a thickly forested area in Missouri. It was the middle of winter, and the snow had been coming down for hours. Visibility was low, and my wipers were starting to ice over, so I decided to pull off at a wide shoulder near a patch of woods and rest for a bit until the snow let up. It was remote, but not the worst I'd ever parked at. I left the engine running and curled up in the sleeper. Maybe an hour later, I woke up freezing. The engine had shut off. My first thought was that I ran out of diesel or the idling had tripped a fault. I slipped on my boots and opened the cab door. The snow outside was undisturbed, except for a line of footprints leading from the woods to the passenger side of my truck. Bare footprints, not boots, not shoes, just feet. In 6 inches of snow. I walked around to the front, wiping the frost off the grill, and saw that someone had opened the front panel of my engine and pulled a few wires loose. It wasn't destroyed, just carefully disconnected, like someone who knew what they were doing had done it. That's when I heard the knocking. 3 slow knocks from inside the trailer. I hadn't even thought about the back of the truck. It was sealed and locked when I left the shipper earlier that day, and I hadn't opened it since. The lock was still intact. I walked slowly toward the trailer door. The snow under my boots crunched loudly, and I swear I could hear my heart beating. Another 3 knocks. This time louder. I didn't open it. Instead, I backed away, got into the cab, locked the doors, and hit the panic button on my GPS system. It alerted the company dispatch and local authorities. I waited. When the sheriff arrived about 30 minutes later, I explained everything. He checked the trailer with me. The lock was still intact, but inside there was nothing. No sign anyone had been in there. No footprints. No disturbed freight. Nothing. He took a look at the footprints in the snow, nodded slowly, and told me a story. Back in the 80s, a local driver went missing on the same stretch of road during a blizzard. His truck was found abandoned, lights off, cab door open, no sign of him, just a trail of footprints leading into the woods, barefoot. They never found his body. Locals said the forest was haunted by his ghost, still walking barefoot through the snow, trying to flag down other drivers. I laughed nervously, thinking he was messing with me. He didn't laugh back. I've had a lot of strange nights behind the wheel, but the worst one came just outside a town called Seligman, Arizona. I was heading west, trying to make time. The sun had just gone down, and I was pushing to hit a rest area before midnight. The road was dead quiet, nothing but flat desert and occasional stretches of old Route 66. Out of nowhere, my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker, breaker, is anyone there?" It was a female voice, static covered, weak. I hadn't heard anyone on the radio for hours. I picked up the mic. "Yeah, this is 83 westbound. Who's calling?" No reply. Then, after a few seconds, the voice came again. "Please help, mile marker 223. I can't see." I looked at my GPS. I was at 219, just 4 miles away. I sped up, keeping my eyes peeled. As I neared 223, I saw it, an old, beat-up station wagon off the side of the road, hazards blinking. I pulled over about 30 feet ahead and grabbed my flashlight. The car was empty. Doors unlocked, engine dead, no one inside. The keys were still in the ignition. But what really chilled me was the smell. It was like rot, moldy meat and wet soil. I walked around the car, shining the light into the dark desert beyond. That's when I heard her. "Please, I'm cold." The voice was close, very close. I turned sharply, flashlight trembling in my hand. There was nothing, just cactus and rock and sand. And then the car radio turned on. Static. Then her voice again. "I see you now." I ran. I didn't even look back. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and peeled out. I didn't stop until I hit Kingman. I told another driver at a diner what happened, and he just shook his head. You heard the girl on the radio? Man, you're lucky. Most who hear her don't come back. He said the legend was known among old-timers, a girl who died in a car crash out there decades ago. Sometimes she called for help on CB radios. If you stopped, she'd try to get in your truck. Some said she'd ride with you until you crashed too. Others said she just wanted company. But none of them said she ever saved anyone. I've been driving for years. I've seen fog roll in out of nowhere, phantom lights, strange figures on the shoulder that vanish when you pass. But those 3 nights, the woman in Gallup, the barefoot man in Missouri, and the radio girl in Seligman, they stay with me. Every time I close my eyes on the road, I wonder if they're waiting at the next stop. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I worked maintenance at a mid-sized hospital in the Pacific Northwest for 15 years. Nothing fancy, just a lot of overnight shifts, fixing flickering lights, checking boiler systems, unclogging sinks, or dealing with power hiccups. I liked the night shift because it was quiet. Most of the time, I was left alone. Doctors would pass by with the occasional nod, nurses would wave, but nobody really bothered me unless something broke. It was the perfect kind of job if you kept your head down and didn't ask too many questions. But over time, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It started with the elevators. We had 6 in the main building. 5 worked fine. The 6th, elevator B, was the one in the east wing that had a reputation. Old nurses said it would go to floors no one pressed. Some said they saw patients inside who'd already died. I always chalked it up to bad wiring or power issues. I'd been in that shaft a dozen times. Changed out motors, checked circuitry. Everything looked normal on the surface, but the logs told a different story. You could see activity at 3:17 a.m. every few days. Calls to floors that were empty, doors opening with nobody inside, sometimes staying open for minutes with no motion detected. One night I was walking past the east wing around 2 a.m. to grab some spare fuses when I heard the elevator ding. I turned the corner and saw elevator B's doors slide open. No one around. Lights flickered once overhead. Then I heard it, faint but clear. Breathing. Not gasping or panicked. Just steady breathing, as if someone was right inside. I stood there, listening. Then the doors started closing. On instinct, I stepped forward, waved my hand across the sensor to stop them. The doors paused, and the inside lights kicked in brighter. The car was empty. I stood there longer than I cared to admit. I looked around, hallway completely still. No shadows, no footsteps, just me and the elevator. Then I stepped inside. I hit the button for the lobby. The car started moving, descending slowly. Around the 2nd floor, the lights dimmed slightly. Not out, just lower, like mood lighting. Then the panel blinked, and instead of 1, it displayed B3. We didn't have a basement level 3, only B1 and B2. I'd been in both. B1 was storage. B2 was archives and some old electrical units that were being phased out. But B3, I'd never seen a blueprint for it, never even heard of it. The car kept descending. The motion felt longer than it should have. You can feel how long a floor takes. You get used to it. But this, it dragged. I checked my phone to see if I could text security. No signal, not even Wi-Fi. The elevator stopped. Doors opened. Complete darkness. Not dim lighting. Not powered down lights. It was pitch black. No movement. No hallway. Just a black void stretching in both directions, as if the elevator had opened into a cave. The floor looked like concrete, but the air, it smelled wrong, like rot and cold metal. Then I heard something moving out there. It was subtle at first. A shuffle, then a soft dragging sound like something was being pulled across the floor. I slammed the door close button. Nothing happened. I hit every floor. Still nothing. Then the panel flickered again, every button lighting up, then going dark. Finally, the doors started closing. As they slid shut, I swear I saw something just outside the light, low to the ground, hunched, not walking, crawling. The doors sealed. The elevator shot back up so fast it made my stomach twist. When it stopped, I bolted out without checking the floor and ran straight to the security office. I didn't say anything, just told them elevator B had a malfunction and needed to be shut down. It wasn't the last time I saw strange things. About 2 weeks later, I was called down to B2. Someone reported strange noises in the archives. I figured it was rats, or maybe some old fans making a racket. I took a flashlight and went down alone. It was colder than usual. Not freezing, but definitely colder than the rest of the hospital. The lights flickered in the hallway as I passed under them. Flickering isn't unusual in those old fluorescent bulbs, but this felt intentional, like the lights waited until I was directly beneath them. The archives room was big, maybe the size of a basketball court, filled with old filing cabinets and rolling shelves. I stepped in and called out. Nothing. Just the hum of machines. Then, in the far corner, I heard it. Crying. Not loud. A soft whimper, like a woman trying not to be heard. I called out again. You okay down here? No answer. Just crying. I walked toward the sound, flashlight sweeping across the dusty cabinets. When I reached the corner, the crying stopped. I swung the light around. No one. Just a large metal cabinet with drawers labeled from the 1970s. I opened one out of curiosity. Inside were patient files. Yellowed, some barely legible. One in particular caught my eye. It had no name. Just a number. 7332. I pulled it out. There were photographs inside. Old black and white images of a woman strapped to a gurney. Eyes wide, mouth sewn shut. A typed page paper clipped to it said, Reclassification not human. No author. No notes. The lights went out. Complete darkness again. I turned the flashlight on. The beam cut through the dark just enough to see the walls. Then I heard breathing again. This time, behind me, I spun around. Nothing. Then the crying started again, closer. I backed toward the door. My hand brushed against the handle. As I turned it, I heard a voice whisper, directly in my ear. You shouldn't be here. I didn't wait. I ran, slamming the door behind me. I turned the corner and didn't stop until I was back in the service stairwell, 3 floors up. The next day, the file was gone. I went back during daylight with another tech. The cabinet was still there, but drawer 7332 had nothing inside. No photos, no papers. I started digging. Asked a few people in admin if they knew of patients stored under numerical IDs. Nobody did. One older nurse, Judith, looked uncomfortable when I brought it up. She pulled me aside and told me to stop asking questions. This place has layers, she said. It's not just rooms and wires. Some wings should have been sealed decades ago. I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and walked away. A few nights later, I was in the control room monitoring the boilers. Around 4 a.m., all internal cameras in the East Wing cut out at once. No power loss, no tripped breakers, just all screens showing static. Then one came back on. Elevator B. I watched the feed. The car sat still on the ground floor. Then the doors opened. A figure stepped out. It was the woman from the photos. Same blank eyes, same stitched mouth. She stood still in front of the elevator, then turned toward the hallway and walked straight through the closed double doors. Through them, like they weren't even there. The feed cut again. I filed an internal report about the glitch, but I didn't mention what I saw. I knew better. After that, I avoided elevator B, avoided B2, avoided even passing near the East Wing. And still, the hospital seemed to follow me. I started having dreams. Same hallway, same elevator. The woman standing at the end, mouth bloody, unstitched. She'd whisper things I couldn't understand, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat. One night I found a note taped to my locker. It said, "They remember you." No signature, just those words. I quit a few months later after I found my flashlight turned on in my car's back seat. I hadn't touched it in weeks. That night I slept in a motel 2 counties away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something had followed me out of that building. I tried to live normally, took a job at a hardware store, talked to people again, started jogging in the evenings. It helped for a while, until last winter. I was driving home on a quiet road around 11 p.m. It was foggy, the kind that eats the headlights. As I rounded a curve, I saw someone walking along the shoulder. A woman. Thin, in a hospital gown. Barefoot. She stopped walking as I passed, then turned her head slowly toward my truck. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. Wide, too wide. I didn't stop. That night, I locked every door, every window. Sat in the living room with a kitchen knife until the sun came up. The next day, I checked online. Found out that the hospital had quietly closed off the East Wing. No explanation. No press. Just structural instability. Same excuse they use when they want people to forget. They won't say it. But I know something was kept there, and now I think it got out. Sometimes I still hear the elevator ding, even though I don't live near any hospitals. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was the summer of 2015 when I took a job as a live-in caretaker for an elderly man named Walter in rural Indiana. I was 24, had just left a dead-end job in Chicago, and needed a change. My cousin had found the posting online. It was a temporary gig, 3 months, decent pay, and housing included. All I had to do was assist an old man with mobility issues and keep the house in order. Walter lived in a large, decaying farmhouse just outside a tiny town called Mitchell, not far from where the land turned from flat fields into slow-rolling forest hills. The place was enormous, 3 stories tall, built sometime in the early 1900s, and covered in ivy that had long since overtaken most of the back porch. The air inside smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sour that I could never quite place. Walter was thin, pale, and always cold, even in the heat of July. He spent most of his time in a recliner in the front sitting room, wrapped in wool blankets, watching a static-filled TV with the volume turned so low I never understood how he could hear anything. He was soft-spoken but lucid, sharp even, and though he didn't talk much, when he did, it was clear his mind was still very much intact. There were 3 rules. 1. Always keep the front door locked, even during the day. 2. Never enter the basement, under any circumstances. 3. Make sure all the windows are shut and locked before sundown. He told me this on the first night as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I asked him why, but he just looked at me and said, "You don't want things from outside getting in." I assumed he was senile. I followed the rules out of respect, but I didn't think too hard about them. The first few days were uneventful. I cooked, cleaned, ran errands, and sat with Walter during meals. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing odd things. Every night around 2:30 a.m., I would hear what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. Not loud, not fast, just slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time. I checked every time. Nothing was there. Then the smell started. I'd wake up with a strange scent in my nose, wet earth, rot, and something almost metallic. I tried airing out my room, changing the sheets, even spraying cologne, but nothing helped. It would go away by morning, only to return the next night. One evening, I forgot to lock one of the kitchen windows before sunset. I'd been out on the porch reading, and by the time I remembered, the sky had gone purple and orange. I rushed inside, latched it, and turned back toward the hallway. Walter was standing there. He hadn't made a sound. No footsteps. Just appeared. He looked terrified. "You left it open," he said, voice shaking. "I just closed it," I replied, holding up my hands. "I didn't mean to. You don't understand. You can't forget again. Ever." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the way his eyes looked. Not angry, frightened, deeply, irrationally frightened. The next day, Walter didn't come out of his room. I brought him breakfast, but he didn't touch it. I knocked a few times, but he wouldn't answer. Eventually, I tried the knob. It was locked. The house felt different without him sitting in the front room. I did my chores, kept to myself, and tried to shake the feeling of being watched. I kept thinking about the basement. I'd never seen the door to it, and it bothered me that I didn't know where it was. Later that night, I woke to a sound unlike the usual creaking and settling of the house. It was a thud, followed by dragging, something heavy being pulled across wood. I sat up in bed and held my breath. Another thud. Then something else, low, rhythmic clicking. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and stepped into the hallway. The noise was coming from downstairs. Against my better judgment, I descended the staircase one step at a time, trying not to make a sound. The dragging stopped. When I reached the bottom, the living room was empty. So was the kitchen. But the side door, the one that led out to the ivy-covered porch, was wide open. I ran to it and looked out. The yard was empty. The cornfields beyond the fence rustled slightly, but I didn't see anything. I locked the door and checked every window again. All secure. In the hallway beside the pantry, I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It blended into the wood paneling so well that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been specifically looking. There was a heavy padlock on it. The basement. I stared at it for a long time before going back to bed. Walter didn't speak for the next 2 days. I left food for him outside his room, and it would be gone by the next morning, but he wouldn't respond to anything I said. I thought about leaving, but something in me couldn't let it go. I needed to understand what was happening. The following night, just past 2 a.m., I heard the dragging again. But this time, it wasn't downstairs. It was in the hallway. I grabbed the flashlight and opened my door. The hall was empty, but the carpet was damp. There were long streaks leading away from Walter's room, as if something had been pulled across it. I followed them down the hall, then down the stairs. The basement door was open. The padlock lay on the floor, twisted and bent, as if something had broken it from the inside. I should have called the police. I should have run. But I stepped inside. The stairs creaked with every step. The air grew colder the farther down I went. My flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, some filled with liquid, others with unidentifiable objects floating inside. There was a workbench, old tools, a rusted sink with brown stains, and then in the far corner I saw Walter. He was on his knees facing the wall, arms limp at his sides. I called his name, but he didn't move. When I got closer, I realized he was murmuring, whispering something in a language I didn't understand. His eyes were open, wide, fixed on a crack in the wall. "Walter," I said again, louder. He turned to me slowly, as if it took effort. "They woke up," he whispered. "I couldn't keep them in." Behind me, something groaned. Not the house, not wood. It was wet, heavy. I turned and saw something sliding out of the shadows. It wasn't human. Too tall, too thin. Its skin looked like dried leather stretched over bone. No eyes, just holes where the nose and ears should be, and a gaping mouth full of needle-like teeth. Its arms hung too low, fingers dragging on the floor, nails clicking like claws on stone. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't try to help Walter. I didn't stop for my things. I ran through the front door and didn't stop until I reached the road. I flagged down a truck driver around dawn. Told him I'd been attacked by dogs. He drove me to a hospital 2 towns over. I never went back for my stuff. 2 days later, I read that the farmhouse had burned to the ground in the middle of the night. No official cause was given. No bodies were found. I tried finding Walter's name in public records. Nothing came up. No birth certificate, no death certificate, nothing. I still have dreams about the basement. Sometimes I hear the clicking right outside my window. And some nights, I swear I wake up to the smell of wet earth and rust. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I worked as a security guard at a large old hotel in a mid-sized town in the Midwest. The building was a historic landmark dating back to the early 1900s and had seen its fair share of renovations, but there were still parts of it that felt untouched by time. The hotel had always had a strange atmosphere. Creaky floors, long hallways, and rooms that, no matter how many coats of paint they got, always felt slightly off. Guests often commented on how they felt like they were being watched, but most people just brushed it off as the building's age. I wasn't so sure. I started working the overnight shifts. It was a quiet job for the most part, just walking the halls and making sure everything was locked up and secure. It was perfect for me, being a college student with odd hours. Most nights I'd sit in the security office, watching the security monitors, scrolling through my phone, or reading a book. Every now and then, I'd take my rounds, checking the back hallways, the kitchen, the storage areas, and of course the floors with guest rooms. The first weird thing happened during my 3rd week on the job. It was about 2 a.m. I was walking the upper floors when I noticed that the elevator on the far side of the hallway was running, even though it hadn't been called. I thought it was a glitch. The elevator system in the hotel was old, and things like this weren't uncommon. I pressed the call button to send it down to the lobby, but the doors stayed closed, unmoving. I made my way down the hall and pressed the button again. Still, nothing happened. At that point, I figured I'd go up to the elevator shaft and check the control panel. Maybe there was a jam. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The elevator doors were slightly open, just enough for a sliver of light to peek through. I hesitated for a moment, but then I shrugged it off, assuming it was just malfunctioning. I approached the doors, reached out to push them open, and froze. There, standing inside the elevator, was a man. He wasn't dressed like a guest, though. He was in a full suit, but his clothes were dirty and worn out, like he'd been wandering through some rough place for days. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty, like he was seeing something far beyond the elevator's walls. His hands were clenched into fists, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. After a few seconds, I mustered the courage to speak. "Sir, can I help you?" Nothing. I tried again, louder this time. "Are you okay?" Still no response. I reached forward and gave the doors a little nudge. To my shock, they opened wider, revealing the man's presence. His skin was cold, unnaturally so, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. But just as I was about to step forward, the doors slammed shut in front of me. I jumped back in surprise, my heart racing. The elevator dinged, and then it started moving, slowly, as if something was dragging it along. I stood there, staring at the elevator as it descended to the lower floors. It didn't stop, didn't open, nothing. It just went down and disappeared. I didn't follow it. I didn't want to. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling. I took a few deep breaths and tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a heavy blanket. The next morning, I reported the malfunction. The maintenance guy checked the elevator, but he found nothing wrong with it. The hotel was old, and sometimes things just happened, he said. I didn't push it. I didn't want to sound crazy. But over the next few weeks, the elevator began malfunctioning more frequently. It was always the same. The doors opening on their own, the elevator running without being called, and sometimes even stopping on a floor that had no one waiting. There were strange instances when I would be walking down the hall and feel as if I wasn't alone, even though no one was there. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. One night, I decided to take my rounds earlier than usual. I was feeling edgy, like something was off, but I didn't know why. It was almost 1 a.m. when I stepped into the hallway and immediately noticed something strange. The elevator was at the top floor again, its doors wide open. I stood there for a moment, considering whether or not I should investigate again. Something told me I shouldn't, but I didn't want to leave it. I'd grown accustomed to the eerie happenings, but this felt different. I walked down the hall toward the elevator, my flashlight flicking across the floor. As I got closer, I saw movement inside the elevator. A woman hunched over, her back turned to me. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, something from the 1920s with frayed edges and faded lace. Her hair was dark, unkempt, and she was whispering to herself in a low, breathy voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I could tell she wasn't speaking to me. Her eyes were wide, though, and her hands shook as she gripped the metal rail inside the elevator. I called out to her, "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head, and when she looked at me, I felt my heart stop. Her eyes were black, no whites, just voids. Her mouth opened, but there was no sound. Her lips moved, and the expression on her face was twisted, like she was trying to scream but couldn't. I backed away, my pulse racing. I reached for my radio, but before I could call for help, the elevator doors slammed shut again. I heard the low hum as it descended, slowly, as if something was forcing it down, unwilling to let it move quickly. I ran to the security office, locked the door, and stayed inside the rest of my shift. I didn't leave. I didn't check the elevator. I didn't want to know what was on the other side of that door. The next morning, I told the manager about what had happened. She didn't seem surprised. She just nodded as if she'd heard it all before and told me, leave it alone. "There are things about this hotel that are better left undisturbed," she said cryptically. I didn't press her for more information. I didn't want to know. But as the weeks went by, the incidents continued. The elevator kept malfunctioning, always stopping at odd floors, the doors opening on their own, people hearing strange noises in the halls late at night, the whispers, the shuffling sounds, the eerie laughter. People started to complain, but they'd always dismiss it as the hotel being old. One night, about a month later, I had to check the boiler room. It was a cramped, dimly lit space deep in the basement, with pipes running along the walls. I hated it down there. The air was thick, and the only sound was the constant hum of machinery. As I stepped through the door, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, in the far corner, was a figure. A man, hunched over, his hands against the ground. His face was obscured by his long, matted hair, but I could tell he was wearing an old, faded uniform. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Sir?" I called out. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't move. I took another step forward, and then, without warning, he turned. His face was pale, ghostly white, and his eyes were hollow, deep black pits. His lips parted in a grin that stretched far too wide, far too unnatural. He opened his mouth at this, but no words came out, just a hollow, raspy sound, like a whisper from a distance. Before I could react, the figure stood up too fast, too jerky. His body twisted unnaturally as he lurched toward me. I screamed and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I bolted up the stairs, through the halls, and didn't stop until I was outside in the parking lot, gasping for air. The hotel was never the same after that. I left soon after, telling them I needed to find something else. The building was sold to a new owner, and I heard later that they had to close it down for a while due to technical difficulties. They say it's reopened now, but I'm never going again. I don't know what happened there. I don't know what those things were, but I know I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something I couldn't understand. Some places don't want to be forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I spent 6 years as a long-haul trucker running loads between the Midwest and the West Coast. People outside the job don't realize how much time you spend alone in total silence. Just the road hum and static on the CB. It can get into your head if you let it. I thought I had a good handle on it. I was careful about my sleep, stayed alert, always picked rest stops with lights and security cameras. Still, I had 3 incidents in those 6 years that I've never been able to explain, and when I talk about them, I get the same question every time. Why didn't you quit? The truth is I came close, but I didn't. Not after the first time, not after the second. The third was the one that made me stop. The first happened in Utah, about 40 miles outside Richfield. I was driving through the Fish Lake National Forest stretch, nothing but dark pines, winding roads, and cliffs. It was about 2:30 a.m., and I remember checking the clock because I was trying to push through to a rest area near I-15. I rounded a bend and saw someone standing on the shoulder, not waving, not signaling distress, just standing. That alone was weird. People don't walk that stretch. No towns nearby, no reason to be out there on foot. As I passed, I flicked on the cab spotlight. Just a guy, late 30s or 40s, beard, dark coat. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead. I got a cold chill. Something about him wasn't right. He wasn't hitchhiking, wasn't even looking at me, just staring across the road like he was waiting for something to come out of the woods. I made it to the rest area 25 minutes later, parked, locked up the cab, and went inside to use the bathroom. Another driver was there, older guy, must have seen 1,000 weird things in his time. I asked him offhand, "You ever see anyone walking that road back there?" He looked up from his coffee. "Fish Lake?" "Yeah." He frowned. "Guy in a coat?" "Yeah." He didn't blink. "You didn't stop, did you?" I shook my head. He nodded once. Good. He wouldn't say anything more, no matter how I pressed. Just said, "Forget it. Don't go back." I thought about that guy a lot after. Tried Googling missing persons cases, urban legends, anything. Couldn't find anything solid. Maybe it was just some drifter or a camper who got lost. But I still remember the way he didn't react to 40,000 pounds of metal passing 10 feet away. Didn't flinch. Just stood there. The second time was 9 months later, outside of Redding, California. I had stopped overnight at a small truck stop. Not one of the big chains, just an old independent place with maybe 6 parking spots, 1 pump, and a cinder block building with a flickering sign. The kind of place that looks half abandoned in daylight and worse at night. I was asleep in my cab, maybe 3 or 4 a.m., when I woke up to knocking. 3 slow knocks, deliberate. Not on the driver's side door, on the sleeper window. It made my skin crawl. That window's higher off the ground than most people realize. You'd need to climb up on the side rail or be over 6 feet tall to reach it easily. I sat up, heart pounding. Didn't open the curtain right away, just listened. Nothing. No more knocks. No voices. Just the hum of the truck stop sign and a diesel engine idling somewhere nearby. Finally, I pulled the curtain back. Nothing there. I flicked on the exterior floodlights. Still nothing. No footprints, no movement. I checked the lot. Just me, a flatbed about 20 feet away, and the gas station. Next morning, I asked the clerk if they had cameras. He gave me this look, like he didn't want to answer. Then he said, "You're the 3rd guy this year who's asked me that. Cameras don't work. Don't know why." I didn't say anything else. Just got my coffee and left. 3rd time, though. That was the one that ended it. I was on a run from Oregon to Nebraska. I'd taken a load of industrial equipment and was coming through Wyoming. Winter had hit hard that year, and the roads were half ice and half dirt. I decided to pull off at a rest area about 20 miles outside Rollins. Snow was coming down sideways, visibility near zero. When I pulled in, it was empty. Not unusual, middle of nowhere, middle of winter. I parked, left the engine idling, and stepped into the restroom building. Just a single, unheated room with 2 stalls and a flickering overhead bulb. The second I walked in, I felt off. Not scared exactly, more like I had walked into someone else's space. I checked the stalls, empty. Took care of business. Washed up. I was drying my hands when I heard the door creak open, figured another driver had pulled in. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see anyone. I turned around. Door was wide open, snow blowing in, no one there. I stepped outside and scanned the lot. Still no other vehicles, just mine, sitting under the flickering floodlight, engine humming. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine, smaller, barefoot, leading from the edge of the woods to the building, and then stopping at the door. Just stopped, no return path, no sign of them going back. I followed them, half thinking maybe someone was in trouble, but they just ended, like someone walked out of the trees and vanished. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the cab made me jump. Wind, ice shifting on the trailer, my own heartbeat. Around 1 a.m., I gave up and started driving again, just to get away from that place. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling I hadn't left alone. Back in Nebraska, I dropped my load and checked into a motel instead of sleeping in the cab. First time I'd done that in years. As I was checking in, the desk clerk, an older woman, asked if I was okay. I must have looked rough. I said, just a bad stretch of road. She looked at me like she knew something. Out west? Wyoming. She nodded slowly. That part of the state? There's places you're not supposed to stop. I asked what she meant. She just said, people go missing out there. Drivers, campers, people who walk into the trees and don't come back. You ever hear of the Slaughter Trail? I shook my head. Old native hunting path. Some say it's cursed. I say there's something older than that. Something the cold doesn't kill. I didn't sleep well that night either. That was my last cross-country haul. I took local routes after that. Nothing overnight, nothing off-grid. After a while, I left trucking entirely. Started working in a warehouse, loading other people's trucks. I still miss the road sometimes, the sunrise over the plains, the quiet. But then I think about that guy on the shoulder, the barefoot prints in the snow, the knock on the sleeper window, and I remember why I stopped. The road isn't empty at night. Sometimes you're not alone out there, even when it feels like you are. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The worst thing I ever saw happened when I was 21 and working as an overnight gas station clerk outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. I took the job because I was broke between apartments, and it was the only place willing to hire someone with no stable address. The station was off Highway 89, isolated, surrounded by dense patches of pine and empty desert beyond that. We got truckers, drifters, and once in a while a lost tourist headed toward the Grand Canyon. I worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift alone. One night around 3:20 a.m., I saw a car pull up. It was an old maroon Buick, early 90s model, beat to hell. The passenger side door caved in like someone had T-boned it and just never fixed it. The headlights cut off, but no one got out. I watched from behind the counter for a few minutes. Still nothing. I went outside to check if the driver needed help. When I got to the car, the engine was off, the keys gone, and no one was inside. It had pulled in just seconds earlier. There was no way someone could have walked off in that time. I checked around the station, shined my flashlight behind the dumpsters, even scanned the tree line. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sound of movement. The car was empty and locked. I called the county sheriff's department. They sent a deputy out around 5 a.m. He asked a few questions, ran the plate. The car had been reported missing 6 days earlier. From a rest stop outside Winslow, 3 hours away. The deputy towed it, shrugged, and told me weird stuff happened in the desert all the time. The next night, I kept thinking about it. I started paying more attention to everything. I noticed how often cars would slow down as they approached the station, then speed up without stopping, or how the lights in the back freezer would flicker around the same time every night, even after maintenance checked the wiring. A week later, a woman came in around 2:45 a.m. She looked completely normal. Jeans, a windbreaker, ponytail. Except her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and she had dried blood on her left shoe. She asked to use the phone, said she'd been in an accident, hit a deer, couldn't find her phone. I let her use the store landline. She dialed but didn't talk to anyone, just stood there with the phone pressed to her ear, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then she hung up. "Do you need an ambulance?" I asked. She shook her head. "Do you want to wait inside until someone comes?" She stared at me. Not past me, not around me, right at me. Then she smiled and walked out. She got into a car that hadn't been there before, a silver Nissan with its engine running, and drove off without headlights. I checked the cameras. There was no footage of her entering the store. Nothing. Just me talking to thin air. That's when I stopped checking the lot when someone didn't come in. I'd learned to leave it alone. 2 months later, on the last week of my job, a man came in a little after 1 a.m. He was tall, wearing a torn suit jacket, and barefoot. His face was bruised, and his knuckles were bloody like he'd been in a fight. He grabbed a bottle of water, slammed it on the counter, and leaned in too close. "You ever hear screaming in the trees?" he asked. I didn't answer. "Out back, the woods. You hear them when it's quiet. They call your name." I rang him up, avoided eye contact, told him to have a good night. He left, didn't even take the water. I threw it away. The next morning, I mentioned it to the day shift guy, Rick. He just shrugged. "Man, this place, shit happens all the time." I pressed him, and finally he told me about a guy who used to work the overnight shift before me. Quiet guy, college dropout. One night he walked out behind the station and never came back. They found his shoes in the woods. That was it. No body. No trace. Rick told me they hired me 3 days later. That was the last straw. I quit the next day. A few years later, I was back in Arizona visiting family. Out of curiosity, I drove past the station. It was gone. Not closed. Gone. Just a concrete slab and a broken signpost. The trees looked the same, though. And for a second, I swear I saw someone standing just inside the tree line. Tall, barefoot, watching me. Another story happened to my friend Mia when we were in college. She lived in an old 2-story house off campus that had been split into multiple units. She rented the top floor with her friend Amanda. The place was quiet and the rent was cheap. About 2 months into the lease, they started hearing noises at night. Not loud ones, just soft creaking, like someone pacing slowly across the attic. They chalked it up to old beams and ignored it. Then things started moving. Amanda's keys would vanish from the hook and turn up in the fridge. Mia's shoes went missing for days and were found outside on the roof. Doors they knew they'd closed would be open in the morning. The bathroom light would be on even after they turned it off. They thought it was each other at first. Maybe one of them was sleepwalking. Until one night, Mia woke up to the sound of breathing. Deep, wheezy breathing, like someone with a chest infection. She thought Amanda was in the room, but when she turned on the lamp, she was alone. She got up to check Amanda's room. Amanda was dead asleep with headphones in. The breathing stopped. Mia locked her door, barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, she noticed something strange. The window in her room, one that hadn't opened since they moved in, was cracked open. There was a dirty handprint on the inside glass. They called the landlord, who reluctantly agreed to check the attic. When he came down, he was pale, shaking. There were signs someone had been living up there. A pile of dirty clothes, food wrappers, a blanket, empty water bottles. And most disturbingly, photos of Mia and Amanda printed on old paper, taken through the gaps in the vents, some while they slept. The landlord called the cops, but by the time they searched the area, whoever had been living up there was gone. They moved out that weekend. The last story comes from my Uncle Ray, a long-haul trucker who's been driving since the 80s. He swore this happened to him outside of Barstow, California, back in 2003. He was driving east through the Mojave around 2 a.m., pitch black, no moon. He'd stopped at a diner an hour earlier, grabbed coffee, and was planning to drive straight through the night. Around mile marker 178, he saw something up ahead. It looked like a person standing in the road. He slowed down but didn't stop. As he got closer, he realized the figure wasn't moving. Just standing there, arms at its sides, not flagging him down or anything. He flipped his high beams on. It wasn't a person. It was too tall. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, like a marionette. Its head was slightly too big, and there were no visible features on its face. Ray swerved to avoid it, but when he looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. 2 minutes later, it was in the road again. Same exact spot. He didn't stop this time. He floored it and flew past the thing. As he passed, he felt an intense wave of nausea and heard something click against the passenger side window, like fingernails tapping glass. When he reached the next gas station, he pulled over to inspect the truck. There were handprints on the door, small ones, child-sized, dozens of them, all smeared like someone had dragged their hands across the metal while it was moving. He washed them off, drove straight home, and refused to take that route again for years. We still ask him about it sometimes just to see if he'll change his story. He never does, and to this day he won't drive east out of Barstow after dark. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the spring of 2015 when I moved into a shared house in Eugene, Oregon, while attending university. The house was old, built in the 1940s, and had the kind of creaky floorboards and thin walls you'd expect. There were 4 of us living there: me, a biology major named Chris, a quiet history student named Lyle, and Jenny, who was studying environmental science. The rent was cheap, the location was good, and the place seemed like a great deal at first. But the longer we stayed, the stranger things became. Within the first few weeks, small things started happening. I'd leave my room for class, come back, and find drawers open that I hadn't touched. Jenny thought someone was sneaking into the house, so we got a new lock installed on the front door and even put a small camera on the porch. Nothing came of it. The recordings only ever showed us or delivery people. Still, the weirdness continued. Chris was the first to say something openly. One morning over breakfast, he looked pale and said he'd been hearing knocking in the walls at night, 3 taps in a row, always around 3 a.m. He'd gotten up to check one night, thinking maybe it was rats or the pipes, but there was nothing there. The knocking stopped when he moved around, only to return when he got back in bed. Lyle shrugged and said older houses do weird things, but Jenny and I weren't so sure. Then things escalated. I started having vivid dreams. Not just normal dreams, but ones that felt too real. Being in the house, but it was empty and covered in rot. In one of them, I walked into the living room and saw someone hanging from the ceiling fan, slowly spinning. I always woke up in a sweat, heart pounding. After one of these nights, I came into the kitchen and found Lyle already there, looking shaken. He told me he'd seen someone standing at the foot of his bed, a man in dark clothing, face completely blank, like smooth clay with no features. He froze, thinking it was a dream, but when he blinked, the figure was still there. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there. Then suddenly it was gone. He refused to sleep in his room after that, crashing on the couch instead. Jenny had the worst experience, and it was the one that made us start researching the house. She was taking a shower late one night and swore she heard someone whispering behind the curtain. She thought it was one of us messing around, but when she pulled the curtain back, no one was there. The bathroom light flickered, and the mirror fogged up fast, faster than it should have. When she looked at the glass, she saw something written in the steam. "He lives here." She ran out of the bathroom screaming, and we searched the whole house, top to bottom. No one was there but us. That night, we stayed up doing research on the house. Public records showed that it had changed owners multiple times in just the past 2 decades. Some owners had only stayed a few months before selling it again. We dug deeper, going through old newspaper archives online. Eventually, we found an article from 1989. A man named Curtis Maddox had been found dead in the house. Suicide, they said. He'd hanged himself in the living room after a lengthy mental breakdown. The article mentioned strange behavior. He'd told neighbors that someone lived in the walls, that he wasn't alone, that something old was with him. Lyle stopped sleeping in the house altogether. He moved in with his girlfriend temporarily. Jenny and I tried to stick it out, but things got worse. One night, I heard the front door open and close around 2:30 a.m. I thought it was Chris coming home late. I peeked out of my room and saw someone walk past, but it wasn't Chris. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that brushed the floor. No sound came from the footsteps. I stood frozen at my door, watching it move down the hallway toward the kitchen. When I finally got the courage to look again, the kitchen was empty. The door hadn't opened again. I checked the porch camera the next morning. Nothing but static from 2:30 to 3 a.m., which had never happened before or since. The next week, Chris started acting strange. He stayed in his room more, barely spoke, and stopped going to class. I tried talking to him, but he'd only mutter about needing sleep. One night, I found him in the backyard digging a hole. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "It's for him. He asked me to." His eyes were vacant. I convinced him to come back inside and called his parents the next day. They picked him up and took him home. He withdrew from school soon after. With Chris gone and Lyle refusing to return, it was just Jenny and me. One night around 3 a.m., we both woke up at the same time. No noise, no reason, just wide awake, drenched in sweat. We met in the hallway without speaking, both of us shaken. I don't know what made me do it, but I opened the attic hatch in the ceiling. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up. The attic was musty, thick with dust. Cobwebs clung to the beams. But in one corner, the insulation had been pulled away, revealing a small crawl space. I crawled inside with a flashlight. At the far end was a stack of notebooks, old yellowing paper, the ink faded in some spots. I opened one and began reading. The writing was frantic, a scrawl that grew more chaotic with each page. They live in the walls, they feed on sleep, they show themselves to those who fear them. There were dozens of pages like that. Drawings too, faces with no eyes, hallways that twisted into nothing. I brought one of the notebooks down and showed Jenny. She barely got through the first few pages before she said she wanted to leave the house for good. We moved out that week, left the furniture, the security deposit, everything. Lyle never came back for his things. Chris didn't respond to our texts. Jenny transferred schools the next semester and I moved into campus housing. I never told my parents why. I don't think they would have believed me. A few months later, I drove by the house just to see it. There was a for rent sign in the front yard again. New curtains in the window, new victims waiting to meet whoever still lived there. In 2021, I was working late nights as a rideshare driver in Sacramento. It paid well, especially with the surge pricing after midnight. One Friday night, I picked up a woman in her 50s from outside a dive bar. She was quiet at first, polite. About halfway through the ride, she asked if I believed in spirits. I said I wasn't sure. She said her daughter had gone missing in 2014. She was last seen walking home from a party, just a mile from where I picked her up. No one ever found her body, no solid leads. For years, the woman had dreams of her daughter standing outside her window, not knocking, just watching. She swore it started happening only after she began sleeping in her daughter's room to feel closer to her. In the dreams, her daughter's eyes were completely black and her mouth wouldn't move, but she could still hear her saying, "Don't let him in." After a pause, the woman asked if I would drive by the spot where her daughter was last seen. I agreed. We pulled up to a quiet, dark corner near a chain-link fence and an abandoned gas station. She stared out the window for a long time before whispering, "That's him." I followed her gaze, expecting a homeless person or someone passing by, but there was no one. "Right there," she said again, more urgently. Still no one. I told her I didn't see anything. She turned to me slowly and said, "He's right next to the car." I turned again. Nothing. Then she let out a quiet gasp and started crying. I didn't ask more questions. I dropped her off and wished her well. Later that night, I checked my car's dash cam. I saw the woman sitting in the back seat. I saw myself driving. At the moment, she whispered, "That's him." A blur passed across the front of the camera, just for a split second. A tall, humanoid shape with elongated limbs and no clear features. I deleted the footage the next day. Earlier this year, my cousin Sam called me out of the blue. He was renovating a house in rural Idaho he had bought at auction. It was dirt cheap because it had been abandoned for over a decade. He wanted me to visit and help him with some cleanup. I owed him a favor, so I went. The house sat at the end of a long gravel road. No neighbors for miles. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, like static electricity on my skin. The house was freezing, though it was warm outside. There were scratch marks along the walls, as if someone had tried clawing their way out. The basement was padlocked shut. Sam said he'd found strange symbols carved into the wood under the stairs. Circles with eyes inside them, old language etched around the edges. He thought it was just some messed up art. I told him not to mess with it. He laughed it off. That night, I stayed in the guest room. Around 2:45 a.m., I woke up to a soft humming sound. I thought it was Sam watching TV, but when I checked the living room, it was empty. I turned around and saw something at the end of the hallway, a shape, tall and dark, its head almost brushing the ceiling. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, Sam was gone. His truck was still outside, but his phone, keys, and wallet were in the kitchen. I looked everywhere. I even broke the lock to the basement. The stairs down were rotting. At the bottom was a dirt floor, and carved into it was a circle with the same symbols he had found under the stairs. I called the police. They searched the property but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no body. Sam has never been found. Some houses are empty because no one wants them. Others are empty because something else already lives there. Story. The end.
Story number 8.
In 2013, I was working as a long-haul freight dispatcher based out of Oklahoma. My job mostly involved coordinating trucks, mapping routes, and staying on the radio during overnight shifts to help drivers stay alert. I became close with a few drivers, especially a guy named Neil, who'd been doing runs for over 15 years. Neil was steady, polite, and not one to complain, which is why I noticed when something started to change in him after a particular delivery in southern Arizona. The job had seemed straightforward, a shipment of dry goods from Amarillo to a warehouse near Ahio. Nothing unusual about the location, except it was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert, accessible by only one unlit, remote road. Neil checked in before entering the area, but then didn't call again for almost 5 hours. That alone wasn't too alarming. Cell service there could be bad. But when he finally called around 4 a.m., his voice was shaking. Not panicked, just wrong. Hollow. He told me, "Don't route anyone else out here." I asked what had happened. He wouldn't say, just repeated that the place wasn't right. He said he dropped the load and left without even seeing another person. Said there were lights in the desert, downtrade, shapes that moved in ways nothing natural should move. I asked if he wanted me to file anything, and he just said, "Forget it. Forget the night. Forget I called." He hung up. Neil didn't work long after that. A week later, he stopped responding to dispatch entirely, quit without warning. I tried calling him once out of curiosity just to see if he was okay. The call went straight to voicemail. A few days later, one of the other drivers said they'd heard from a cousin and Neil had checked himself into some kind of private hospital in Colorado for psychiatric care. I chalked it up to burnout. You hear a lot of stories in this line of work: sleep deprivation, isolation, long stretches of nothing but road. But something about the way he said, "Don't route anyone else out here," stuck with me. Almost like a warning. A few months passed. Then one night, one of our newer drivers, Jeremy, accepted a last-minute load. His intended route took him within 15 miles of that same Ajo warehouse. I didn't think anything of it until he failed to check in after midnight. I called and got nothing. Radioed. Nothing. His GPS signal froze for over 2 hours before resuming, showing him parked near an abandoned rest stop. When I finally got him on the line, his voice sounded off, distant. He said, "I saw it." I asked what he meant. He replied, "There's something out there, in the dark. It watches. It mimics." That was all he would say before he started crying quietly and hung up. He left trucking altogether after that, deleted his social media, moved back in with his parents in Kentucky, and stopped speaking to anyone from the job. 2 unrelated drivers, 2 trips near the same place, both leaving their careers behind with broken voices and empty eyes. A year later, the Ajo warehouse burned down. The cause was never determined. No arrests, no insurance claims. Just gone. I never routed anyone near that region again. Back in 2006, my brother Daniel and I were helping clean out our late grandfather's house in rural Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful 2-story house surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. We spent most of the day boxing up old books, tools, and furniture. Late into the evening, I went up to the attic alone to sort through some of the older belongings, while Daniel worked in the garage. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with the smell of old wood and insulation. There were trunks and boxes everywhere, some dating back to the 1930s. In one trunk, I found dozens of old photographs, mostly black and white. One in particular stopped me cold. It was a photo of a man standing in the woods behind the house. He wore a long coat, and his face was blurred, not by age or camera quality. It was like something had scratched over just his face. As I sifted through more photos, I noticed the same man appeared repeatedly. Different times, different years. Sometimes closer to the house, always staring toward the camera, but always with his face scratched out or distorted in some unnatural way. None of them had names or dates written on the back. I took the stack down to show Daniel. His face drained of color. He said, "I saw that guy once, outside in the woods, like 10 years ago." He told me he had been staying at our grandfather's place for a week during summer break. One night, he woke up and saw someone standing at the tree line, just watching. He assumed it was a hunter or trespasser and went back to sleep. The next morning, he found footprints in the dirt outside his window. Our grandfather had never mentioned anything about strange people or problems with neighbors. In fact, he hardly spoke about the woods at all. The only odd thing we found among his belongings was a stack of old journals. Most were mundane, gardening notes, weather records, but a few entries were different. One, dated 1971, read, "Saw him again. Same coat, same place, never moves, never blinks. I nailed the door shut." Another, "Daniel came to visit. Told him not to go near the trees. I saw the man again last night." My brother and I spent that night in a hotel. We finished clearing the house the next day and left the attic locked. 2 years later, the new owner of the property died of a heart attack in his sleep, aged only 42. There were no reports of disturbances, but we heard from a neighbor that the man had begun acting strange during his final months. Reclusive, paranoid. Said someone was watching his house from the woods. We never went back. My cousin Lauren went missing for 3 days in 2017. She'd gone hiking alone in the Sierra Nevada mountains, something she did every summer. She was an experienced hiker, always prepared, carried GPS and emergency gear. But one morning, she simply didn't return. Her last message was a text to her mom. "Made camp near the lake. Beautiful here. Wish you could see the stars." When the rangers found her, she was barefoot, disoriented, and covered in scratches. She refused to speak for the first few hours. When she did start talking, her words didn't make sense at first. She kept repeating, "It wore my face." She finally opened up a few weeks later. Said she'd been woken on the second night by movement outside her tent. She peeked out and saw herself, her exact self, standing at the tree line. It didn't move, just stared. She thought it was a hallucination and went back inside, but the next morning her gear had been rifled through. Her boots were missing, her food scattered. On the third night, she heard singing. Not words, just a soft hum in a voice identical to hers. She didn't sleep. At sunrise, she ran. Left most of her gear behind and sprinted toward the trailhead until she collapsed from exhaustion. That's when the search team found her. She hasn't gone hiking alone since. She keeps blackout curtains on her windows and doesn't own any mirrors. Whatever happened out there, she's never truly recovered from it. In 2019, I rented a cheap apartment in an old converted house in Portland. It had 2 units upstairs, one on the ground floor. My neighbor upstairs was an elderly man named Mr. Harrow. He lived alone and kept to himself. Every now and then I'd hear him moving around at odd hours, heavy footsteps, dragging sounds, sometimes faint humming. It was an old building. I didn't think much of it. One evening I came home to find the landlord in the hallway. He told me Mr. Harrow had passed away in his sleep 2 nights earlier. I was confused because I had heard movement from his apartment the night before. The landlord swore no one had entered since the coroner took the body. That night I heard the dragging again. Then humming. I convinced myself it was just in my head. The next morning I noticed something off with the window in my living room. It was unlocked. I always locked it. On the windowsill was a thin smear of something dark. Too dark for dust, too red for rust. I wiped it off and tried not to think about it. A few nights later I woke up to soft knocking. Not on the door. On the wall behind my bed, which separated my unit from the stairwell. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath. It stopped. Then I heard someone whisper my name. Just once. The next morning, I called the landlord and asked if he had re-entered the upstairs apartment. He hadn't. Out of curiosity, I asked if Mr. Harrow had any family. He said no, but then added something that chilled me. "You know," he said, "he was the one who used to clean the building years ago. Used to live in the basement before it was remodeled. Sometimes I think he never really left." I moved out 2 weeks later. I worked as a park ranger in northern Michigan for 2 summers. Most of the job was routine, clearing trails, helping tourists, checking campsites. But every once in a while, you'd hear stories. One of the older rangers, Carl, had a saying, "If you hear a baby crying in the woods, run the other way." I thought it was just some dark humor until one night around 2 a.m., I was doing a solo patrol near a less traveled part of the park. I was on foot because the ATV had gotten stuck earlier. As I walked the trail, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A baby crying. It came from deeper in the woods, away from the trail. I radioed in, thinking maybe someone had abandoned a child. My supervisor told me to stay on the path and wait. I didn't listen. I walked into the trees, following the sound. It always seemed just a bit further. After maybe 10 minutes, the crying stopped. Total silence. Not even bugs. I turned around to head back and realized I couldn't see the trail anymore. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked different. I started calling out, trying to get a response from the team. Nothing. Then I heard something move behind me. Not a branch. Something heavier. Footsteps. I turned with my flashlight and saw nothing, but the footsteps continued, circling me. Then from maybe 20 feet away, I heard the crying again. But this time it was distorted, like a recording being played backwards. I ran. Eventually I stumbled back onto the trail, gasping for air. The next day, Carl asked me if I'd heard the baby. I nodded. He just said, "Good, now you know." I didn't return the following summer. Every one of these stories stays with me. They're from different people, different places, different times, but there's a thread running through them all. Something ancient, something cold. Sometimes it hides in the desert, sometimes it waits in the woods, sometimes it moves into houses and follows you down the stairs, and sometimes it wears your face and waits until you're alone. Story the end.
Story number 9.
In the fall of 2019, I was working as a home inspector for a small real estate company in western Pennsylvania. Most of my work took me to older properties, abandoned homes, dilapidated farmhouses, or small-town residencies that hadn't seen renovation in decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I liked peeling back the layers of these buildings, discovering secrets long forgotten. But there was one house, one job, that made me question everything I thought I understood about the world. The house was in a place called Strickland Hollow, a nearly forgotten stretch of woods with maybe a dozen houses and no stores, no gas stations, barely even a road. It was part of an estate sale, and my job was to evaluate the structure before it was listed. The woman who called it in, the niece of the former occupant, said no one had lived there for nearly 12 years. Her uncle had gone missing in 2007 and was never found. She had inherited the house but had never visited it herself. The place sat at the end of a long gravel drive, flanked by thick woods. When I pulled up, the house looked almost like it had grown from the land. Ivy crawling up the siding, the front porch sagging slightly under its own weight, and every window reflecting the trees behind me like black mirrors. I checked the locks, surprisingly intact, and let myself in. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not rot or decay like you might expect, but something chemical and sharp like a mix of old varnish and formaldehyde. The air inside was heavy still, as if it hadn't moved in years. I began in the kitchen. Outdated appliances, water damage on the ceiling, some mold near the baseboards. Typical stuff. But then I noticed that every drawer had been removed and placed in a perfect stack on the floor. Not messy, not haphazard. Stacked precisely, like someone had taken deliberate care to do it. The cabinets were empty, but the shelves had deep scratch marks in them, as if something had been clawing its way inside rather than out. In the hallway, the walls had pictures still hanging. Most were family photos from the 70s and 80s, smiling kids, a man in thick glasses, a woman in an old dress. But one photo, placed near the floor by the baseboard heater, had been turned completely around. Not fallen, turned. It struck me because the wall behind it was clean, no dust where the frame had been, which meant it had been flipped recently. That didn't make sense. That didn't echo. No one had lived here in over a decade. Upstairs, things got worse. The main bedroom had been stripped bare. No mattress, no sheets, no clothes, just the bed frame turned on its side like someone had tried to barricade the door with it. There were long scratches down the inside of the door, deep enough to dig through the paint and into the wood. Not like fingernail scratches either. They were too wide, too deep. Something else made those. The second bedroom had old toys stacked neatly in the corner, wooden blocks, a stuffed bear, a broken rocking horse with one eye missing. And scrawled across the far wall in black crayon were the words, "It's still upstairs." I remember stopping and staring at that wall for a long time. I told myself it was just a prank. Kids, maybe. Or maybe the uncle who went missing had suffered some kind of mental break. That's what made the most sense. But the deeper I went into that house, the more my logic began to unravel. I opened the door to the attic last. It was a narrow pull-down ladder, one of those that groaned under your weight. When I climbed up, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It was much colder up there than it should have been. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. I had to use a flashlight because the bulb overhead had been smashed. The floor was covered in old newspaper clippings, dozens of them, yellowed and curled at the edges. They were all about missing people. Not local ones either. These were from all over the country: Utah, Maine, Texas, Oregon, some dating back to the 1950s. Then I found the journal. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard, water-stained and barely legible. Most of it was gibberish, scrambled words, pages torn out, symbols that looked like they were drawn by a child. But the last few pages were clear. They talked about the thing in the walls, how it had followed him home from somewhere, how it would whisper at night and scratch to be let out. His last entry was dated July 14th, 2007. It simply read, "I nailed the attic shut, but it's not enough. It's learning." I closed the book and left that house faster than I'd ever left any job. I called the office, told them I was done for the day, and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't tell anyone what I found. Not the family, not the agency. I took the files I had, the photos, and locked them in a box in my garage. I wanted to forget it. But things started happening after that. At night, I'd hear scratching in the walls. I lived in a townhouse with paper-thin drywall and cheap insulation, so at first I thought it was mice. I called pest control. They found nothing. Then the dream started. I'd wake up at 3:14 a.m. every night on the dot, gasping, drenched in sweat. The dreams were always the same: a dark hallway, something crawling behind me, whispering my name. I could never see its face, just feel it getting closer. One night, I woke up and found deep scratches along the inside of my bedroom door, identical to the ones I'd seen in that house. I left the next morning and stayed at my sister's for a few weeks. But the feeling followed me. I'd hear footsteps at night. Doors would open and close on their own. Her dog refused to enter the guest room I was sleeping in. Eventually, I moved across the country, changed my number, got a new job, everything to start over. But some nights, I still wake up at 3:14 a.m., and when I do, I swear I hear something scratching at the walls again. The second story comes from a friend of mine, a trucker named Henry. We met years ago when I was doing freelance work for a logistics company. Henry was the type of guy who didn't spook easily. He'd driven through every kind of storm, hauled loads across the worst highways, even slept in his rig during sub-zero temperatures. But one night in Nevada changed him permanently. He was driving east on Route 50, what they call the loneliest road in America. It was just past midnight, and he hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The road was dead straight. No lights, no signs, just endless desert on either side. That's when he saw the girl. She was standing on the side of the road, dressed in a white gown, barefoot, staring into the distance. Henry slowed down, thinking she was hurt or had been in an accident. But when he got closer, she turned and looked right at him. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. He pulled over about 30 feet ahead and climbed out with his flashlight. But when he turned back toward where she'd been standing, she was gone. He swept the desert with his light, thinking maybe she'd run or passed out. But there was nothing there. No footprints, no sound, just empty sand and scrub brush. Henry climbed back in his cab, uneasy but thinking maybe he'd hallucinated. Long hours and no sleep will do that to you. He kept driving. About 30 minutes later, he saw her again. Same girl, same gown, same expression, standing on the shoulder like she'd never moved. Only now she was closer to the road. He didn't stop this time. He told me that as he passed her, he made the mistake of looking into his side mirror. She was gone from the road, but in the reflection, she was standing directly behind his trailer, staring up at the cab. That's when he floored it. He drove for another 2 hours without stopping, and when he finally pulled into a small gas station outside Ely, he said his hands were still shaking. The cashier took one look at him and asked if he'd seen the Hitcher. Turns out, other drivers had reported similar sightings over the years. A woman in white, always alone, always watching. No one knew who she was or where she came from, but every person who'd seen her claimed the same thing. She never walked. She just reappeared, again and again, farther down the road. Henry doesn't take that route anymore. The third story comes from a paramedic named Carla, first met through a mutual friend. She'd been working night shifts in Detroit for a few years and had seen her share of awful things. Overdoses, stabbings, accidents. But nothing ever stuck with her, quite like the 911 call from an abandoned apartment building on the east side. The call came in at 2:03 a.m. Male voice, whispering, hard to understand. All he said was, "She's in the walls, please help me." Then the line went dead. They traced the call to an old housing complex that had been condemned for years. No electricity, no tenants, not even squatters as far as anyone knew. But protocol said they had to check it out. Carla and her partner arrived to find the front door ajar, the lobby choked with dust and old graffiti. The elevators didn't work, so they climbed the stairs, flashlights sweeping the dark hallways. On the 5th floor, they found him. A man in his 30s, completely naked, sitting in the center of the hallway, his eyes wide with terror. He kept repeating the same phrase, "Don't let her out. Don't let her out." His body was covered in deep scratches, arms, chest, even across his face. They tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond, just kept rocking back and forth. Then they heard the knocking. It came from inside one of the boarded-up apartments down the hall, slow, rhythmic, like fingernails tapping wood. Carla said it wasn't loud, but it chilled her to the bone. Her partner went to check it out, but Carla stayed with the man. He looked up at her then, his voice barely a whisper. "It knows your name now." They called for backup. The police showed up and cleared the building, but found nothing. No signs of anyone else. No signs of forced entry. And the apartment with the knocking? Empty. Completely sealed. No one inside. The man was taken to a hospital and later admitted to a psychiatric ward. He never explained what happened, and eventually he stopped talking altogether. Carla swears she still hears knocking sometimes when she's alone, always in threes. Always late at night. These stories, mine, Henry's, Carla's, they stay with you. Not because of what we saw, but because of what we almost understood. Because deep down, we all know something's out there. Watching. Story the end.